Dark Lord Sauron forged in secret a master ring.
The Lord of the Rings franchise needs no introduction, and J.R.R. Tolkien's fascinating world has been immortalized through the books and movies and TV shows. Sauron is the infamous overarching antagonist, even though his presence is more of an indirect one in the books, and we only get to see him in the movies in a flashback to the War of the Last Alliance. It's the magnitude of his corruptive influence and some of his heinous actions that have made him the ideal embodiment of evil. In this video, we'll take you through the entire history of Sauron, and you'll find everything that you need to know about this twisted Dark Lord. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. How did Sauron come into existence? Exploring his lore before the First Age. Before we head into a deeper backstory of Sauron, it's important to understand the concept of the Valar and the Maiar in the Tolkien universe. When the universe was created, the supreme being Eru Ilúvatar created a series of lesser gods called the Valar to shape the order of what was about to follow. The Valar were helped by subordinate spirits called the Maiar, the individuals who went on to be known as the Five Wizards in the Middle-earth: Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, and the two unnamed Blue Wizards. The Valar, who was charged with the creation of raw physical matter, was Aule the Smith, and he was helped by his primary Maiar called Mairon. With time, Mairon went on to become a skilled craftsman under the guidance of Aule. However, there was one major problem with Mairon's personality. He was opposed to anything that was not ideal or perfect, and this perfectionist nature eventually unleashed his dark side. He was unhappy with the imperfections of the creatures like the elves, who were made out of flesh and blood and placed in his perfect world. Mairon believed that the world was too chaotic and sought to gain complete control over everything to impose his brand of order. He found the perfect ally in Melkor, who was the first and most powerful Valar, and despised his siblings and deemed them as inferiors. He also wanted to destroy the Middle-earth and all its inhabitants, and Mairon, on the other hand, was keener on dominating the world instead of destroying it. He became Melkor's ally because it was the easiest way for Mairon to achieve his ambitions. When the Valar found out about Melkor's intentions of destroying everything that they created, he was exiled, but Mairon became his spy in the homeland of Valinor. He secretly informed his master about his dealings with the Valar, and by the time Melkor established a significant stronghold in Middle-earth, Mairon left Valinor and declared an open allegiance to Melkor. Even the Valar now recognized him as an enemy, but it was a little too late, and he'd maintained the ruse long enough to avoid detection. This Melkor is who we've later known as Morgoth, and Mairon is none other than Sauron, the worst form of evil in Tolkien's entire universe. Now, you might have a clear idea on why Sauron is such an expert craftsman. He was, after all, the subject of the greatest in the trade, Aule, and learned his skills from there. Sauron initially went by the name Mairon, and it was only later that he got his familiar identity of the evil lord. Ironically enough, if Mairon stayed on the path of goodness, he could have been a blessing for the universe and helped it flourish further, but that was not to be. How did Sauron evolve during the First Age? We've already spoken about Sauron, aka Mairon's obsession with perfection, and this is where Melkor managed to influence him in a big way. Back in the First Age, Melkor had created his fortress of Angband in the northwestern lands. Sauron was now a lieutenant of Melkor, and he was located at Angband during this time. The elves and men were regarded as the children of Ilúvatar, and they were thought to be godly creations, even though Sauron and Morgoth didn't regard them as perfect. As a mockery of their existence, Morgoth managed to breed the orcs, and Sauron helped him in this mission. However, their unchallenged reign was soon about to come to an end with the Battle of the Powers, or the War of the Gods. During this war, which was fought during the Years of the Trees between the Valar and Melkor, the Valar wanted to free the elves from the influence of the evil lord. During the initial stages of the war, Sauron did his best to help Melkor, and he faked a resistance against the Valar at Angband just to buy him some more time and gather forces at Utumno. The ploy didn't succeed, and ultimately both Angband and Utumno were sacked. Melkor was captured by the end of the war. Sauron was nowhere to be found. This is where the Valar made a crucial mistake, probably in haste, and ended up overlooking his escape. They were keener on capturing the Dark Lord Melkor, and Sauron was yet to be a genuine threat in their eyes. They also made the mistake of not capturing or destroying the Balrogs, who were the Maiar, corrupted by Morgoth. The Balrogs went into a hibernation awaiting the return of Morgoth, and it was the making of something terrible that was about to happen. Now that Melkor was gone, Sauron assumed complete leadership and took control of the situation. He started off with the reconstruction of Angband, Angband, and even the number of orcs multiplied many times under his rule. This was when he got the name Sauron, and the Sindar elves also referred to him as Gorthor, which meant the dread abomination. During this time, many elves were about to undertake the Great Journey, or the Great March from Cuiviénen to Valinor, and these elves were named the Eldar. They undertook this journey on the aftermath of the war between the Valar and Melkor, which had destroyed much of the northern Middle-earth. It's likely Sauron harried the elves during this journey and even directed Melkor's servants abroad and created hindrances like affecting the weather. His leadership was so effective that Angband was ready with a massive orc army by the time Morgoth returned. Morgoth, aka Melkor, had remained in the halls of Mandor for 3 ages, and after he faked repentance, was ordered to be released. It initially seemed like the evil of Melkor had ceased to exist, but the illusion didn't last for long. Manwë, who pardoned Melkor after believing his feigned repentance was free of himself, could not comprehend the twisted nature of Melkor. But even though he was released, Tulkas and Ulmo still kept a closer watch on him and refused to trust him completely or forget the evils that he was capable of, and they were not wrong in their suspicion. Now, Melkor was more vengeful and furious than ever before and started to make use of his cunning nature. He held a lot of grudge against the elves because he believed that the race was indirectly responsible for his ouster. He wanted to corrupt them, and he worked his evil magic on the Noldor among the 3 main groups of elves. The Noldor had the perfect open ears and were extremely useful, making them the perfect target for Melkor. He went ahead spreading lies about the intentions of the Valar in bringing the elves to Aman, and he told them tales of the coming of men. This came as a surprise because the elves were not aware of the existence of men. The Valar had kept this information from them. The lies of Melkor finally started to show results when some of the Noldor started to believe his false propaganda. They felt that they were brought to Aman so that the men could inherit Middle-earth. It seemed like an unfair and partial treatment to the elves, where the men would gain their lands and glory should have been rightfully theirs in the first place. The seeds of discontent continued to worsen. Finally, the Noldor openly rebelled against the Valar. Feanor, the firstborn son of Noldor King Finwë, was among the main leaders of this rebellion, and he expressed his displeasure over the treatment that these elves had received. He wasn't exactly a loyal follower of Melkor and knew about his evil ways, but Feanor was too proud to bow down before the injustice done to his people. Meanwhile, the Valar knew nothing about how Melkor had been instrumental in stirring up the rebellion, and they simply held Feanor responsible for the entire movement. The Valar still didn't take any major action, but the rebellion started to get out of hand when Feanor threatened his brother Fingolfin. At this point, the Valar summoned him to the Ring of Doom in Valinor so that he could explain all his actions. Finally, the interaction with Feanor revealed the lies that Melkor had carefully hidden so far. Soon, the 2 trees of Valinor were destroyed. These trees were called Telperion and Laurelin, and they brought light to the land of the Valar during the ancient times. Even though Melkor and Ungoliant destroyed the trees, their last fruit and flower were turned into the sun and the moon by the Valar. The era brought in the awakening of men, and Morgoth left Angband during this time, leaving Sauron in charge of the war. Melkor was focused on corrupting the second-born kindred of the children of Ilúvatar. During this time, Sauron launched an attack on Tol Sirion. This was an island on the upper reaches of River Sirion, and Finrod had erected the Tower of Minas Tirith there because it was a strategic location. Anyone who defended the Isle was terrified of the magnitude of Sauron's attack. Soon enough, Sauron took over the tower and transformed it into a strategic watchtower for Morgoth. He changed the place into the Isle of Werewolves, and next up, Morgoth ordered Sauron to find and kill Barahir and his companions. Barahir was one of the few who had dared to contest Morgoth's dominance, but he was outnumbered and chose to remain in hiding. Sauron ended up capturing one of Barahir's companions named Gorlim, and he promised to free him and his wife Eilinel if he revealed the information on Barahir. In utter desperation, Gorlim obliged and told Sauron all he knew about the hiding place of Barahir. However, Sauron was not true to the deal that he'd struck with Gorlim, and after learning all about Barahir, he simply told Gorlim that his wife had been dead all along and killed him as well. After Barahir was put to his death, his son Beren swore to get his revenge and roamed the Dorthonion as an outlaw. His deeds of bravery were soon widely known, and Morgoth set a price on his head because it was clearly another major opposition to his reign. Sauron, as the loyal commander of Morgoth, sought him out, but Beren wasn't easy to find. In the course of time, Beren, Finrod, and 10 of their companions left Nargothrond and went on to search for the Silmarils, the 3 priceless gems created by none other than Feanor in Aman. The group of outlaws posed as orcs to avoid detection, but it didn't work because Sauron became suspicious of their movement when they entered the Vale between Ered Wethrin and Tara Nufuin. One of the reasons behind his suspicion was that the orcs passing through this region were supposed to report to him first. Sauron had the group captured and brought before him. Finrod and Sauron engaged in an epic battle, and it was almost a match of equals because Finrod was extremely powerful as well. However, he still couldn't overpower the mighty Sauron, who wasted no time in revealing their true selves from their orc disguises. However, Sauron still didn't know about their real identity entities and only put them into dungeons where a werewolf devoured them one by one. Even when they were faced with this extreme situation, the survivors still did not betray each other, and finally it was just Finrod and Beren remaining after all their companions had fallen. When the werewolf tried to attack Beren, Finrod stepped in to defend him and killed the werewolf, even though it wounded him fatally. Finrod passed away from his wounds, and Beren was saved from certain death. Meanwhile, Luthien arrived on the bridge of Tolkien. She was the only daughter of King Thingol of Doria and Melian the Maya, and it was believed that Luthien was the fairest maiden among all the children of Iluvatar. When Sauron set his eyes on her, he immediately wanted to capture her so that she could be handed over to Morgoth. With this in mind, he sent one of his wolves to the bridge, but Huan killed the wolf in no time. Huan was the Hound of Valinor, and this great wolfhound had been granted special powers by the Valar. He looked as big as a horse, was immortal and tireless, and it was prophesied that he could only be killed by the greatest wolf that ever lived. Sauron sent a few more wolves, and Huan killed them all. Finally, a frustrated Sauron sent the mighty Draugluin, sire of the werewolves of Angband. It led to a fierce fight with Huan, but Draugluin had to bow down before his great strength. Even though Draugluin fled in an injured state, he still managed to tell Sauron about the presence of Huan before dying. Now, Sauron was aware of the prophecy to kill Huan, and he took on the form of a mighty werewolf, which was reportedly the greatest that the world had ever seen. He headed toward the bridge, and his intimidating appearance even rattled Huan for a while. However, when Sauron tried to leap toward Luthien in this werewolf form, she drew her magic veil over his eyes and caused him great fatigue and blindness. At this opportune moment, Huan jumped over Sauron, and it was a brutal and vicious fight that followed. Even though he tried his best, and even though Luthien was weakened because of Sauron's malice, Huan still emerged as the winner. He held Sauron in his jaws, and the former couldn't break free, even though he tried to change his form and turned into a serpent and even took his own shape. He was forced to yield to Luthien, and he gave up his control over the Isle in return for his release. This was the first major defeat that Sauron experienced, and in order to recover and fight back, he fled to Taran Fuin in the form of a vampire, filled the forests with horror. The final moments of the First Age saw a drastic change in Sauron's fortunes. Suddenly, his days of glory and conquest changed with the War of Wrath. During this war, also known as the Great Battle, the forces of Morgoth fought the host of the West, aka the host of the Valar. The war lasted for over 4 decades, and finally, Morgoth was defeated. The devastation of the war left the land in bad shape, but it was a decisive victory against Morgoth because several slaves from Angband were released after his defeat. Sauron was a clever opportunist, and he was quick to repent his evil deeds in this situation because he feared the wrath of the Valar. He was ordered by Eonwë to return to Valinor so that he could face the judgment of Manwë, but Sauron never intended to suffer the humiliation and punishment. He simply fled and hid himself in Middle-earth, courtesy of his incredible shape-shifting skills. On the other hand, Morgoth was taken to Valinor in chains, and it seemed to have ended the reign of evil forces for the time being.
Your new master, Sauron.
What's the narrative around Sauron in the Second Age? Things were relatively quiet for Sauron during the beginning of the Second Age, as he remained in hiding for 5 centuries. When he finally felt that the Valar had forgotten about Middle-earth, he returned to his evil ways once again. His immediate followers were men in the east and south who had already been corrupted by Melkor, and these men readily followed him. By SA 882, Gil-galad, the last High King of Noldor in Middle-earth, sensed something wrong and sent a warning to Numenor. By SA 1000, Sauron realized the growing power of the Númenóreans, and he then chose to make Mordor into a stronghold. With this in mind, he started building the Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower near Mount Doom. Sauron also started to understand the importance of elves among his ranks. While men were easier to sway and influence, the elves were much more powerful, and he sought to include elves into his service. However, the life of secrecy was not yet over for Sauron, who stayed hidden and continued to increase his powers secretly for many more years. Finally, in SA 1200, Sauron put up an entirely different form and called himself Annatar, aka the Lord of Gifts. He claimed to be an emissary from the Valar, and it was all a clever plan to hide his real identity. Even then, the likes of Elrond and Gil-galad didn't completely trust him, and refused to deal with him, even though they were yet to know who he really was. It was the same for Galadriel, who was suspicious of him, even though most others in Eregion received Annatar warmly. His skills in art, craftsmanship, and magic were great, and the Noldorian smiths marveled at his knowledge and learned from him. Annatar was also instrumental in developing the skills of the Gwaith Myrdain, along with Celebrimbor, who was the grandson of Feanor. The Gwaith Myrdain was a brotherhood of elven master craftsmen who eventually created the Rings of Power. By SA 1500, the elves reached the heights of their powers and skills, and they started to forge the Rings of Power, which would eventually change everything as we knew them. Annatar led them into thinking that the Rings of Power would help them in preserving their supremacy over Middle-earth, but little did they know what Sauron actually had in mind. 10 years after the Rings of Power had been completed, Sauron created the one ring that could control the bearers of the other rings. He put in all of his powers to forge the ring, and made sure that it would be significantly more powerful than the others. Using this power, he finished the building of the Dark Tower as well. Upon the One Ring, it was written in Tengwar, what was later known as the Black Speech inscription: "One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them." Sauron's deception game was finally over the moment he put on the One Ring. The elves and Celebrimbor were aware of his reality, and they figured out that they'd been betrayed all this while. They all hid their rings from Sauron, who now demanded that these rings be given to him because he was the one who guided the entire making process. When the elves refused his demands, another war was inevitable. Meanwhile, Sauron completed the construction of the Black Gate of Mordor so that invasions could be prevented, and he also raised large armies of orcs, trolls, and men to fight by his side. He became their king and almost a godly figure for these subjects, and he prepared several fortified towns, and also armed those fighting for him with iron. By SA 1693, the war between the elves and Sauron had finally taken shape. It ended up becoming a bloody conflict and nearly destroyed Eregion and a major part of Eriador. Unfortunately, the war also saw an end to Celebrimbor, who was killed and impaled on a spike before being paraded. The elves started losing the war, and they were pushed back to the Blue Mountains, and they were in a precarious state after their allies the dwarves retreated back behind the walls of Moria, where they were safe from Sauron. However, an unexpected help came from the Númenóreans, who responded to their call for help and sent out a relief force to their aid. This united front managed to fight back against the evil armies of Sauron, and they were defeated and forced to withdraw to Tharbad. The defeats of Sauron's armies forced the Dark Lord to flee back to Mordor, and he only had a few orcs and bodyguards by his side during this time. It's also interesting to note that while the 3 greatest rings were hidden away by the elves, the other 16 rings of power were either captured or destroyed by Sauron. He gave 9 rings to men, knowing that they were easier to corrupt, and he left 7 rings for the dwarves. While the dwarf lords managed to resist the power of the rings to corrupt them and submit before Sauron's will, they did develop an uncontrollable lust for gold, which did their kind great damage. Meanwhile, the 9 men were all corrupted by the effect of the rings, and they became the Nazgûl, aka the deadliest servants of Sauron. In this dire situation, most of the men of Middle-earth fell before the power of the ring, and things would have been a lot worse if the elves failed to recognize the treacherous nature of Sauron. Even the elves would have been captured as his slaves in similar fashion, and this makes the resistance posed by Celebrimbor extremely important. Finally, after some initial success in the war, Sauron was caught off guard by the intervention of the Númenóreans, as we've discussed before. The Battle of Gwathio in SA 1700 marked a major defeat for his forces, and Sauron had to spend the next centuries preparing for another decisive war, and he tried to rebuild his strength all over again. It almost seems like the biggest problem while fighting Sauron is his ability to slip away without getting caught. There have been times like the Battle of Gwathio when he could have been destroyed for good, but the cunning shapeshifter always found a way to escape. Again, after regaining his strength and gathering a few large armies, he was powerful enough to conquer Middle-earth one more time at the end of the Second Age. He took up the title of Lord of the Earth, which was not well received by the proud kings of Númenor. The last ruler, named Ar-Pharazôn, intended to contest the might of Sauron for dominance over Arda, and he'd gathered a remarkable Númenórean army that could pose a serious threat to Sauron's army. Eventually, by SA 3261, Ar-Pharazôn landed in Umbar in Middle-earth alongside his overwhelming troops and demanded a complete surrender from the Dark Lord. Even Sauron was wise enough to understand that his forces would be no match for the Númenórean might. This is when his cunning nature and quick-thinking abilities came to the rescue yet again. He assumed a fair form and tried flattery to impress the king. Even then, the king demanded him to be brought to Númenor as a hostage, and Sauron wasn't entirely happy with this decision. This posed an opportunity for him to destroy the land and people from within, and he proved to be truly brilliant when he managed to become one of the king's most trusted advisors within a few years from being a lowly captive. He exploited the fear of death among the Númenóreans and converted many of them into worshipping Morgoth. Sauron propagated that Morgoth had the power to make them immortal, and he also built a temple to Morgoth, where he even performed human sacrifices dedicated to Morgoth. He manipulated the king and the people to this extent that he finally managed to convince Ar-Pharazôn to go up in arms against the Valar and attack Valinor. It was almost ending up as the perfect plan, but for one slight disruption caused by Eru's intervention, the great land of Númenor was drowned under the sea and their powerful navy was destroyed. Meanwhile, the army of Númenor that had reached Aman were buried under the falling rocks and mountains, and many were imprisoned within the caves of the Forgotten. Only a few faithful Númenorians, who were led by Elendil and were friendly with the elves and obedient to the Valar, survived the onslaught. They founded two realms in exile, Gondor and Arnor in Middle-earth. After this major twist in the narrative, only the elven ships were allowed to sail into the utter west. Even Sauron's physical body was destroyed, but his spirit refused to back down. He headed back to Mordor with the ring, and with time, he even rebuilt a new body for himself. However, he no longer possessed the ability to assume a fair shape, and his new regime was marked by terror and brute force. How was Sauron defeated at the end of the Second Age? It didn't take long for Sauron to find out that his sworn enemy, Elendil, whom he'd always disliked, was now lording over Gondor and Arnor. He let fury get the better of his judgment and waged a war against both Arnor and Gondor. What Sauron failed to recognize was that he hadn't recovered completely, and he was still a long distance away from his full strength. On the other hand, Elendil was joined by the Elven king Gil-galad, who had increased his powers considerably by now. This made their alliance superior to Sauron's forces, and the writing was on the wall for the Dark Lord. They called it the last alliance of elves and men, and they attacked Sauron in a fierce encounter that left his armies defeated. The Battle of Dargoland was a major turning point in the fortunes of Sauron, and soon the combined armies of Elendil and Gil-galad invaded Mordor. Barad-dûr was under siege for 7 years, and eventually Sauron lost his patience and came to duel them personally. He managed to slay both Gil-galad and Elendil, but he was also overthrown in the process. To make matters worse for him, the son of Elendil, Isildur, used his father's broken sword to cut off the one ring from Sauron's finger. Losing the ring was a major blow for the Dark Lord, and his physical body was destroyed yet again. His spirit managed to endure the crushing defeat, and he fled. It was an end to his ambitions, where he aspired to defeat the free people and lord over them. And to add to the bad news, his most powerful weapon was now taken from him. But how did he recover from this almost irredeemable situation? How did he cause trouble in the Third Age as well? We'll find out more on the sinister details of Sauron in the following segment. Exploring Sauron's entire story arc in the Third Age. Before we head into Sauron's narrative in the Third Age, it's important to look back at what happened to his ring that was taken by Isildur. It wasn't the best decision-making from him, as he refused to destroy the ring in the fire of Mount Doom, where it was forged. Instead, he kept the ring with himself. But the fortunes didn't last long, as he was betrayed a few years later. Isildur was killed by the orcs at the Gladden Fields, and the ring fell into these fields and remained lost for over 2 millennia. The Gladden Fields were a marshland located in the vale of the Gladden River, and it wasn't easy to find a ring in this wilderness. After many centuries, Deagol, aka Nahald, a store hobbit, found the ring. At the dawn of the Third Age, Sauron was defeated but not vanquished, and he still existed even though he was severely weakened. He remained in non-corporeal form, but the reason that he didn't wither away was because he poured a lot of his powers into the One Ring. While it remained and continued to exist, so would Sauron. He spent the initial days of the Third Age in hiding, because he was simply not strong enough to face any of his opponents. With time, Sauron finally regained much of his strength, and he also developed a physical form of sorts. By TA 1000, Sauron started showing signs of his resurgence one more time. He occupied the stronghold of Dol Guldur, the hill of sorcery located in the southern Mirkwood region. He kept working in secret because he still couldn't afford to draw much attention to himself. In order to ensure his secrecy, Sauron posed as a dreaded sorcerer known as the Necromancer. This form of Sauron was enough to confuse the elves, who had no clue that this was the Dark Lord that had wreaked havoc across Middle-earth through his evil schemes. While Sauron was hiding out in plain sight as the Necromancer, the Valar sent 5 Maiar as the order of wizards who would rally the free people of the world. This was all the more important in case there was another resurgence of Sauron that needed to be countered. Little did they know that Sauron's resurgence was already in motion, unknown to all. Among the 5 Maiar, Gandalf became the main enemy of Sauron, who was dismissive of the step taken by the Valar to counter his threat. Also, do you remember when we spoke about the Nazgûl, or the Nine, who were the ring servants of Sauron in Middle-earth? They reappeared in TA 1300. and this was a major boost to Sauron's powers. He had spent all this time in gathering strength and planning his next course of action, and the return of the Nine bolstered his chances significantly. They started to attack the Númenórean kingdoms in exile on the behalf of Sauron, and as a result, the kingdom of Arnor was completely destroyed. The kingdom of Gondor, too, was greatly weakened, and these were the first signs that the evil forces were coming together for one more assault on the forces of nature and righteousness. Even the northern orcs living in the Misty Mountains, who had been quiet for some time, now grew bolder and started to create secret strongholds. They also blocked the passes between Eriador and the Vales of Anduin, and everything was going according to a part of a wider plan. The dragons, which were ancient and intelligent creatures feared and admired in Middle-earth, destroyed the dwarven mansions. As a result, the 3 dwarf rings among the 7 were consumed, and even their immense treasure hoards were taken over. Gaining courage from all these events, a group of men called the Easterlings also renewed their rivalry with the Gondorians and Northmen. Their new wave of attacks on the western lands was also clear signs of a major resurgence of Sauron that was almost inevitable at this point. With so much happening, it was enough for Gandalf to suspect the return of Sauron, and he acted accordingly. Gandalf had observed the actions of the Nazgûl and all other coordinated attacks of the evil forces, and he infiltrated Dol Guldur to get a confirmation of his suspicion. Unfortunately, Sauron had already fled to keep his identity a secret, and this started off a relatively peaceful period from TA 2063 to TA 2460, called the Watchful Peace. During this time, Gondor was completely free from the attacks of Sauron and his forces, and this time was utilized to strengthen the borders of this region. The forces also tried their best to keep an eye out for Sauron, who had fled to the east. However, as you may have known by now, Sauron wasn't someone who would remain dormant for too long. He wasted no time during this period of peace and forged alliances with various Easterling tribes. By the time he returned to Dol Guldur in TA 2460, he not only had more manpower, but also a renewed strength. Coincidentally, this was also the same year when the One Ring was discovered by the Stor, Smeagol, and his friend, Deagol. The former murdered Deagol to secure the ring for himself, and he was significantly changed by the corruptive nature of the ring. Smeagol got the name Gollum and was banished from his people for his twisted ways. He led a life away from everyone in the Misty Mountains. Meanwhile, Dorin's Bane, a Balrog of Morgoth, drove out Dorin's folk from Khazad-dûm, and Sauron's creatures were unleashed by TA 2480. It was a slow but steady build-up, which eventually made the final battle unavoidable. When Erebor was sacked, Gandalf believed that Sauron could take advantage of the weakened state of Middle-earth and attack the likes of Rivendell and Lothlorien. He could also try to regain Angmar, which he previously lost, and Gandalf felt that Sauron could use Smaug, the lethal fire drake, and a great dragon to cause widespread devastation. Finally, around TA 2850, Gandalf had entered Dol Guldur, and it's now that he figured out that the necromancer was Sauron all along. The White Council, which was an esteemed group of elves and wizards of Middle-earth, now took notice of the threat, and they attacked Dol Guldur with Saruman's approval. The confrontation did not end well for Sauron, who was weak without the possession of the One Ring. On the other hand, the combined power of the 3 elven rings was overwhelming alongside the power of the White Wizard. Sauron could only make minimal use of his extreme powers, and he was driven out of the fortress quite easily. He chose to abandon Dol Guldur, realizing a certain defeat, and used the time to prepare for the next battle and emerge stronger. He went back to Mordor and declared his supremacy in TA 2951. These were the final signs before the final war for the dominance of Middle-earth, and Sauron, in spite of all his defeats, was still putting up a brave fight against his enemies. How did the final War of the Ring unfold? Was Sauron destroyed permanently? After heading back to Mordor, the initial days were glorious for the Dark Lord as he assembled insanely large armies of orcs and enslaved men from the east and south. He also gathered the support of his terrifying subjects such as the Nazgûls, and it was during this time that he adopted the symbol of the lidless eye. This is famously known as the Eye of Sauron, and it became a symbol of power and fear back in Middle-earth, where most of his threats accepted his supremacy. It was said that very few could endure the terrible gaze of this eye, and it was also used as a symbol on the armor and banners of Mordor. The Eye of Sauron also became instrumental in searching and tracking the paths of the ring-bearer Frodo Baggins by the end of the Third Age. Sauron then made use of the Palantiri, or the Seven Stones, which were translucent stone objects used to communicate and gather intelligence. He communicated with Saruman, who now possessed the Orthanc stone, the Palantir placed in Orthanc. He even managed to manipulate the White Wizard into his service by promising him uncontrolled power, and he wanted to use the White Wizard as the means to bring down Rohan, a great kingdom of men between the Misty Mountains and White Mountains. For Sauron, the subjugation of Rohan would allow him a second means to crush down Gondor, and it was an effective strategy. strategy. Around this time, Gollum was finally captured, and Sauron used all his methods of torture against him to extract the truth. And it didn't take him long to realize that this was none other than the One Ring. He sent out the Nazgul to retrieve his ring, and Saruman also tried to find the ring first so as to please his master and regain his favor. However, Sauron experienced a bitter disappointment when the White Wizard was defeated by the Rohirrim and Ents. This meant that Sauron lost one of his most powerful allies, and also the large army of Uruk-hai, the strongest breed of orc who were regarded as the best warriors in Middle-earth. It was a major blow to the Dark Lord, but he still wasn't defeated by any means. After the defeat of Saruman, Peregrine Took, one of the closest friends of Frodo, used the Orthanc Stone and ended up communicating with Sauron accidentally. This led to Sauron believing that his treacherous servant had got wind of the ring, but when Aragorn used the Palantir to reveal himself to Sauron, the Dark Lord knew that his minion had fallen. He now thought that the heir of Isildur possessed the One Ring, and this brought in a lot of fear and doubt into his mind. He was wary of his enemies using the ring against him, and this caused him to hasten his other plans. For instance, he hadn't planned on attacking the city of Minas Tirith so early, but chose to go ahead with it anyway. The idea was to crush the defenses of the city even before the enemies got a chance to fortify it, or the men of the West could unite their forces under one king. However, the plans of Sauron continued to be a failure. The combined forces of Rohan, Gondor, and the Dunedain of Arnor ensured that Sauron's army was vanquished. He still had enough of his forces left to raze Minas Tirith to the ground, but by now, the conquest of Middle-earth was no longer an easy task for Sauron. Seeds of doubt had begun to creep into his mind, and this made him hesitate in his decision-making. He chose to wait and watch as he hoped for a period of war between Aragorn and the other Ring Lords, which he believed would be the perfect opportunity for him to step in to take the ring for himself. Meanwhile, Sauron's enemy camp had wise leaders like Gandalf and Aragorn, who knew that Sauron was still a force to reckon with a major part of his armies still in Mordor. These forces were preparing for another of their lethal attacks, and with such an overwhelming presence, it was almost impossible for Frodo Baggins to reach Mount Doom without getting detected. The commanders realized the seriousness of the situation, and they called for a council that was presided over by Gandalf as a representative of the forces in Minas Tirith. Gandalf stated before all the other commanders that the mini-victory was not decisive, and Sauron's forces couldn't be destroyed completely by force. Thus, there were only two options that could be tried out. Firstly, the remaining forces of these allied powers could be stationed and bolstered by reinforcements to hope to stop the next attack from Sauron. The other option was to take a force to the Black Gate and challenge Sauron directly, which would also have the element of surprise. The force to be taken to Black Gate was almost a suicide mission, but it would only need to be enough to offer a basic resistance, because the idea behind the mission was to distract Sauron. If the Dark Lord failed to look into his own land, it'd increase the chances of the Ring-Bearer, who would be traveling through these perilous terrains. Gandalf's strategy had another masterstroke, where he assumed that looking at the size of the small attacking force, Sauron could potentially assume that the One Ring was in their possession. Who else would be foolish enough to challenge the mighty Sauron with a force that small? Eventually, they all went ahead with this daring plan, and it worked wonders. The Dark Lord led his troops towards Udun, hoping to crush the men of the West, and this left the plains of Gorgoroth relatively undefended. Frodo and Sam could reach Mount Doom quite easily, which should have been nothing short of an impossible mission otherwise. However, the ruse didn't last for long, because when Frodo reached the cracks of Doom, he failed to control the urge of the ring and put it on. This alerted Sauron immediately, and in a desperate and frantic attempt, he sent in the Ringwraiths to secure the prize. His efforts were a little too late, because by this time, Gollum had taken the ring from Frodo and he fell to his death into the cracks of Doom. This caused the ring to be unmade, and massive shockwaves were created around Mordor, which destroyed Barad-dûr. Now that the great fortress was gone, the cone of Mount Doom erupted, and the 8 remaining Nazgûl were consumed in the flames. Now, Sauron had lost his most important source of power, and he was defeated from all ends. With a major part of his incredible powers gone, even his spirit couldn't conjure a new body that could take shape. In reality, Sauron was still indestructible, and his mind and being remained, but they were bound forever to Ea, which was effectively the vision of Ilúvatar. Never again could he grow back his strength to put up a fight against his enemies. The dominance of the Dark Lord was over for good, and it was a rather dramatic end to a character who lasted for thousands of years. Why can't Sauron change forms? It's no secret that Sauron is a master of changing forms, and the reason behind his shape-shifting skill is also quite interesting. According to the Tolkien lore, Sauron is a Maya spirit who ends up being corrupted. His shape-shifting ability is one of his main powers, and he retains the same even after the defeat of the evil Lord Morgoth. In the recently released The Rings of Power, this shape-shifting ability of Sauron has been captured quite accurately. Even when he's murdered by Adar, he simply turns into black goo, similar to venom, and he takes on another humanoid form. He pretends to be the humanoid king Halbrand and poses as the long-lost king of the Southlands. Later, he takes a different form so that the likes of Adar and Galadriel are not able to detect him easily. Of course, the show deviates significantly from Tolkien's works, but Sauron's different forms can be observed in the movies and books as well, which we'll cover in the next segment.
My lord.
Exploring the different forms of Sauron in the Lord of the Rings universe. Sauron is often described as the Deceiver, and it's not surprising that he has multiple forms in the Lord of the Rings universe. Much of it can be owed to his shape-shifting abilities, and this has also helped him last for ages through the conflicts between various races like men, elves, hobbits, and dwarves. The ability to conceal his real identity has helped him earn the trust of his enemies at times, and we've also seen this in the recently released Amazon series, Rings of Power. While the version of Sauron that you see in Peter Jackson's The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings trilogy is similar to the antagonist from Tolkien's extensive lore, the Lord of the Rings movie appearance is quite different from the author's description in the books. In this segment, we'll take a look at some of the major forms of Sauron that have been observed over time. Mairon. This is the original form of Sauron created by Ilúvatar, and this was intended to be the force for goodness, peace, and order in the Middle-earth. There's a hint of biblical themes in this storyline, because J.R.R. Tolkien was a devout Christian. The story of Sauron was similarly framed as Lucifer, Morningstar, the fallen angel who ended up becoming Satan. Mairon was Sauron's first form, and he wasn't intended to be a Dark Lord in the first place. Before turning into an evil version of himself, Mairon was fair and handsome, and he preferred order instead of chaos. However, things changed with time, and his service to Morgoth changed him drastically. The Mairon version of Sauron was lost with time, but he still managed to put up this face in Middle-earth in order to gain the confidence and trust of the elves. He's the perfect example of the proverb that appearances can be deceptive. Sauron. After he was corrupted and served Morgoth, the Mairon version no longer remained in him. Tolkien described this next phase as larger than a man, but not gigantic, and his shape-shifting ability was at its peak during this time. He simply wanted to subject Middle-earth to the sense of order that Morgoth aimed to bring in. At this stage of his life, Tolkien purposely avoided a deeper description of Sauron and simply presented him as evil personified. He could take any physical form that he desired, and the process of transcending into the force of evil that had become the Eye of Mordor had already begun. The Serpent. While making use of his shape-shifting ability, Sauron frequently turned into a wolf, especially during battles. The serpent form was also quite intriguing. This was seen particularly before Morgoth's defeat during the First Age, and Sauron appeared as a giant serpent. This was one of his rarer forms, but nonetheless it still helped in causing confusion among the enemies. The Wolf. This is best known for being Sauron's infamous beastly form in combat, and is one of his fiercest versions. After he betrayed Ilúvatar and served Morgoth, Sauron had to endure certain challenges, such as the inability to maintain a physical presence in the traditional sense of the term. He could no longer remain Mairon, and during this time he found out that he could transform into a deadly werewolf. When he entered various confrontations as a giant and snarling wolf, it was indeed an intimidating sight. Most opponents didn't stand a chance when he appeared in this form, and only the dwarves and the high elves were courageous enough to face his dangerous avatar. The armored physical form. This version of Sauron emerged during the end of the Second Age of Middle-earth, and this looks like a hulking armored form. We don't get a clear picture of what he looked like underneath his armor, but it's in this avatar that he destroyed Númenor. The director, Peter Jackson, did well to give this a visual shape, and the appearance was intimidating enough for the fans. This is the look of Sauron that made him one of the most impressive cinematic villains of all time, and it's an embodiment of pure evil and darkness. The vampire form. This is another of Sauron's forms that shows his inevitable ties with the dark side, but one shouldn't mistake him to be a vampire. In fact, even though he appeared multiple times in this form, he was never really one of the nasty blood-sucking creatures. According to Tolkien's lore, vampires did exist, but they were not like the traditional vampires we see in pop culture. They're actually large, bat-like creatures that served Morgoth and Sauron. And in the Silmarillion, it's mentioned that Sauron took the form of a vampire on a few occasions. This was done to flee Huan, and not to scare the opponent or engage in warfare. The Eye of Sauron. The great eye that watches over Mordor has to be one of the most commonly known forms of Sauron, especially because of the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy. For most of the movies, Sauron has been shown to appear as a fiery eye whose penetrative gaze could see beyond the borders and overlook the volcanic fields of Mordor. This is commonly known as the Eye of Sauron, and it observed anyone who crossed the Shadowlands. For this reason, Frodo and Samwise had to be extremely careful during their journey to Mount Doom, and the Eye of Sauron is often regarded as the final appearance of Sauron. Necromancer. The form of a necromancer is among the most interesting avatars of Sauron, and this is largely because Tolkien didn't initially plan for the primary villain of The Hobbit to be the same antagonist who troubled Middle-earth since the First Age. It was much later that he decided to make the necromancer as a form of Sauron, and this is the form in which Sauron started his restoration in the Third Age. Gandalf was the one who suspected about his whereabouts during this time, but the White Council didn't listen to his warnings. Even the likes of Galadriel, Saruman, and Elrond couldn't weaken the necromancer form, and they failed to stop Sauron from becoming more powerful. The restored form of Sauron. During this point in his life, Sauron didn't appear in the sharpened, armored form as he did from the beginning of Peter Jackson's movies. He was only manifesting as the Great Eye atop Barad-dûr in Middle-earth, and he sent emissaries to speak for him. However, it should be noted that Sauron could take a physical form during this time if he wanted to, and simply chose not to. He was probably vulnerable after being defeated by Isildur, and for this reason he remained away from attention. Only Gollum, who was tortured by Sauron during this time, gave an account of his appearance. Halbrand. Anatar. The entire charade of posing as a human king was an attempt to gain the trust of Celebrimbor in the city of the Elven Smiths, so that he could be tricked into forging the Rings of Power. In the show, The Rings of Power, Sauron has been shown to adapt the form of Halbrand, and he successfully deceived Galadriel for the entire first season. He also gifted the elves the idea of binding Mithril with other ore, which would eventually bring about their own doom. The versions of Halbrand or Anatar are reminders of the immense deceiving traits of Sauron and how effective he could be, even without a direct show of his powers. What happened to Sauron after his defeat? Was Sauron immortal? The antagonists of the Lord of the Rings franchise were such god-level beings that they were never really truly destroyed, even after their defeat. Thus, the end of the Lord of the Rings didn't mark the end of Sauron or Saruman, because of their divine spirits. Only their physical bodies could sustain damage, but their souls were essentially immortal, which meant they couldn't die. This led to Sauron's return after his crushing defeat by Isildur during the Second Age, but Sauron's final defeat was a bit more decisive in nature, even though it didn't destroy his entire existence. After the One Ring was destroyed, it effectively marked the end of Sauron's dominance as well. The soldiers stationed at the Battle of the Black Gate watched Sauron's spirit rise from his body, and in Tolkien's words, it seemed to them that black against the pall of cloud, there rose a huge shape of shadow, impenetrable, lightning-crowned, filling all the sky. Of course, it was a terrifying sight, but Sauron was no longer a threat now that his physical body was destroyed. Now that the One Ring was destroyed, Sauron could no longer make a new body because he was too weak and powerless to do so. So, basically, even though Sauron survived the final attack, his defeat was so impactful that he became completely powerful. However, Gandalf was quick to point out that Sauron's defeat wouldn't bring about peace so easily, because many of his minions still survived, and many other evil forces were lurking about the Middle-earth. Also, it couldn't be ruled out if someone at some point would come up with something to bring back Sauron in his physical avatar. The concept was left wide open, and unfortunately nobody really explored these wild possibilities. As far as the narrative's concerned, it's indicated that Sauron followed Morgoth into the same devastating path into the Void, which was the mysterious space outside all creation, where the Valar banished Morgoth in the First Age. The best way to describe Sauron's condition after his defeat would be that he became a weak spirit who couldn't be heard or felt, and it was just the weakest existence that you can imagine, incapable of troubling the mortal realm. One could say that there couldn't be a better punishment for someone like Sauron, because a sudden death would have simply been the easy way out for him. He was an immortal being, but he probably wished that he wasn't. Such was the impact of the defeat and the destruction of the One Ring. Exploring the complex personality of Sauron. The personality and philosophies of Sauron were difficult to understand because they were always in a state of constant change. He started off as a wise Maiar with a great value for order and perfection, but soon he was corrupted under the influence of Morgoth. As the lieutenant of Morgoth, Sauron simply tried to create a world that was the perfect version of Morgoth's ideal universe. During this time, Sauron didn't exercise much of his free will, and he wasn't much of a free thinker either. It all changed after Morgoth was banished and Sauron had to take over his reign. Suddenly, his lust for power grew manifold, and he sought absolute domination over everything and everyone. He was almost as cunning and evil as Morgoth had been, and during this time period, Sauron was simply ruthless and merciless in Middle-earth. His aggressive and wrathful nature meant that anyone who didn't toe the line was slaughtered, and he didn't care about how many fell in the process of achieving his ultimate regime. He despised free will and almost became obsessed with dominating Arda. Every life form that existed, he wanted to enslave, and every form of opposition he wanted to destroy. Sauron wasn't even hesitant to kill all the women and children of Minas Tirith when it came to that, and he just destroyed the entire population of the city. The only ones safe from his wrath were his slaves and orc armies who followed him blindly. Aside from his vicious and violent side, Sauron was also an extremely smart adversary. He knew how to take advantage of greed and corruptibility of other individuals, like the Nazgûl. He despised the free men because they refused to join him, and he wanted to destroy the entire world of these men by attacking Rohan and Gondor. Sauron was also a fierce enemy of the elves, and his presence in the Second and Third Age forced many to leave Middle-earth out of fear. We've also observed a tendency in Sauron to torture and torment his enemies, and he derived some kind of sadistic pleasure from these. Overall, he was the perfect embodiment of evil, and everything that he did had some hidden motive to fulfill his own ambitions. Sauron reached the heights of corrupted individuals because he was once the best among the righteous. Tolkien was reportedly a religious man, and the entire depiction of Sauron is bound to remind one of the fallen angel. What made Sauron so powerful that he almost became near invincible? So great was the extent of Sauron's power that much of it was left to our imagination. Even then, the glimpses of his insane superhuman abilities that we got were enough to understand just how overwhelmingly powerful he was. His master Morgoth was regarded as the most powerful of the Valar, and Sauron himself was surely among the most powerful Maiar. A great example of his powers could be observed during the Third Age when he was in a weakened state, and still one of the most powerful characters in the narrative. In this segment, we'll explore the depths of his abilities, or at least the ones that have been evident from the stories. Sauron was a master of necromancy, and he could twist and change the perception of his enemies because of his manipulating nature. When he dealt with the Númenóreans, he deceived them to their own downfall by promising them eternal life if they worshipped Morgoth and followed his ways. His craftsmanship was almost of superhuman levels, and it was implied multiple times that he was the best in business because of his great knowledge of worldly substances and how to work with them. He was one of Aule's people, and his skills were only second to Aule. As the Dark Lord with sinister plans in Middle-earth, he used his craftsmanship knowledge to forge the One Ring, and he also built the remarkable fortress of Barad-dûr. He put together his manipulation skills and craftsmanship talents to convince the elves to make certain artifacts that could do great good, but his ultimate plan was to use them for his own domination. Sauron wanted to halt the flow of the natural order of the world, and the elves initially had no idea who they were up against until it was a little too late. Sauron also had significant pyrokinesis abilities, and he could manipulate the use of fire as one of the chief lieutenants of Morgoth. This came in handy several times during key battles, and just like Morgoth, Sauron could also alter the physical substances of the world around him with the simplest of efforts. His weather-controlling abilities were also an extension of his pyrokinesis powers, and we've seen him control the volcano of Mount Doom to abide by his will. What many people often ignore is just how physically strong Sauron was. It was easy to overlook his physical prowess because it often didn't come down to him fighting someone using brute strength. But his vast physical strength was not to be trifled with. Especially when he had the One Ring on, he could kill several soldiers with one single hit. Equally impressive was his combat skills, and this could be observed when he defeated both the Gondorian king and Noldor. However, it's also important to note that even though Sauron possessed these insane physical strength and powers, he still preferred to do things strategically, and his first course of action would mostly avoid direct confrontation if he could. Now, let's come to that ability of Sauron's that makes him who he is, and the ability that we best know him for, his shape-shifting powers. We've already explored at length how Sauron could change his physical form into just about anything, and he was probably the best when it came to this particular ability. This allowed him to deceive his opponents quite easily, and he could manipulate them according to his will, because they often had no clue who he really was. We've covered the different forms of Sauron in this video, and turning into a giant wolf or a great serpent or even a dark sorcerer with a towering height have mostly yielded the desired results for Sauron. He only lost his ability to change into a pleasing form after Eru destroyed Númenor in the aftermath of Sauron's great conspiracy. Last but not least, one simply couldn't ignore the immense intelligence of Sauron, which was probably the deadliest aspect of him, even though it didn't seem like it. He was easily among the most intelligent creatures, and his skills in every subject from politics to warfare made him the evil genius who could control the proceedings. Of course, he largely used these powers to manipulate others, but nevertheless, this was one of his best characteristics that don't get discussed enough. As for his level of deception, his biographical narrative that we provided you in this video should be sufficient proof of his manipulation tactic. He fooled the elves, and later the Númenóreans. During his long drawn-out battle with the forces of good, Sauron often outsmarted his opponents by manipulating or misleading them. With so much going in his favor, and combined with his immortal status, one could almost wonder what brought about his downfall. As it turned out, the Dark Lord also had a few chinks in his armor, and these weaknesses eventually ended up being his Achilles heel. What were some of Sauron's major weaknesses that bogged him down? Ironically enough, Sauron's biggest strength also went on to become one of his major weaknesses. While he created the One Ring, he put in a lot of his powers and personal being into the ring in order to exert a certain supremacy over the other rings that he created. However, this also meant that Sauron was extremely dependent on the One Ring, and after the ring was lost, he was caught up in a state of paranoia where he wondered the consequences of his enemies finding the ring. Later, when the ring was destroyed, it led to the dissolution of his form and weakened him considerably. Sauron's lack of morality also came back to haunt him at times. He'd absolutely lost the sense of right and wrong, and he simply judged things on the basis of power. This meant that he could never value concepts or ideas, and he could never really predict that his enemies would destroy the One Ring, which would lead to his crushing defeat. Sauron's arrogant nature also became one of his major weaknesses. There were times when he simply didn't consider the chances of his failure. Also, this led to a few situations where Sauron lost his composure and gave in to spiteful urges. After he was defeated by Isildur, his ego was hurt so badly that he sent all his forces to fight Aragorn's army, and this crucial mistake allowed Frodo to destroy the ring. What made Sauron's One Ring so special? We can't have a complete discussion on Sauron and his storyline without delving into one of his most prized possessions, the One Ring. This was the most powerful artifact created in Middle-earth, and also known as the Master Ring and Ring of Power. The One Ring was crafted by none other than the Dark Lord himself. It was created in the fire of Orodruin, aka Mount Doom, during the Second Age. The main purpose of this ring was to enhance the powers of Sauron and also allow him control over the other rings of power, which were created by Celebrimbor and the Gwaith y Myrdain with the help of Sauron. The One Ring was Sauron's pawn to lord over the elves and the other people of Middle-earth, but fate had some other plans for the Dark Lord. One of the major properties of the ring is the effect that it has on those who put it on. The wearer is immediately shifted into an unseen realm, and one of the major effects of the ring is invisibility to all physical beings and high visibility to the unseen beings like ring wraiths. There are also some adverse side effects for the mortals who try this ring on. The bearer immediately develops a strong attachment to the ring, and they become more and more reluctant to let go of this source of power. The lifespan of the mortal being would be extended indefinitely, but as Gandalf explained, the long life would come at a cost. Gandalf also deduced that if the One Ring was worn very frequently, the bearer would grow wraith-like with time. Even if one kept the ring and didn't wear it, all these effects would only be slowed, but still couldn't be avoided indefinitely. Essentially, the ring corrupted the mind of the bearer, and we've seen the likes of Gollum kill his own friend under the negative influence of the ring. There was almost an element of sentience in the ring, and aside from being an evil extension of Sauron, the ring could also call out to other people in an attempt to have them take possession of the ring or even kill the current holder. Ever since the One Ring was cut off from Sauron's hand, it kept trying to find a way to get back to its master. Another example of the ring's sentience was that it could change sizes and slip off fingers randomly if it so chose to. There were several other major powers associated with the ring, but one thing remained constant throughout the process. With great power came great corruption, and this was the perfect example of an object so powerful that it couldn't be wielded by the lesser beings. It even became the reason behind the downfall of Sauron, the one who created the ring in the first place. What can we expect from Sauron's character in the Rings of Power? The latest iteration of Sauron has been quite impressive, even though the Amazon series has received some criticism from the fans. The ongoing Season 2 started off by revealing the origins of Sauron thousands of years ago in an interesting prologue. Jack Lowden played the earlier form of the evil elf who was murdered by a pack of orcs, and later Sauron was reborn from some black goo and took the form of Charlie Vickers. He later betrayed the man who saved him, and the premiere connected to Season 1 when Sauron posed as a distressed Halbrand and met Galadriel following a shipwreck. The story tied up with the moment when Sauron met Celebrimbor at his forge, where he created the first 3 rings. Going by what the creators had to say about Sauron's character in the series, they didn't make him into a completely evil character because Tolkien once suggested that no one was evil from the beginning. However, this is quite different from the earlier movies and Tolkien's lore because we don't find much goodness in Sauron or reasons to sympathize with him. The narrative will probably take you through the journey of Sauron. We've already been hinted with a possible face-off between Celebrimbor and Sauron in Episode 8. The comparison between Oppenheimer and Celebrimbor was also on point, and the creator of the show mentioned this in an interview. Because of the impact of their work on the rest of humanity, we'd probably get to the creation of the One Ring and the horrors unleashed by Sauron following his rise back to power. He would trick Celebrimbor into creating the most powerful weapons that could potentially destroy Middle-earth. However, according to Sauron, he was simply doing the right thing. We also expect a showdown between Sauron and Adar, and the likes of Elrond Elrond and Galadriel are surely going to get a lot of screen time going ahead. You can be sure of witnessing a lot of Sauron's evil schemes and cunning manipulation tricks, because the show should lay out the groundwork for the kind of dominant evil force that he'll become with time. Marvel's verdict: most iconic antagonist, for a reason. There's a reason why Sauron is regarded so highly among the supervillains of all time. He's a pivotal character in Tolkien's lore, and yet he doesn't have it easy for himself at any point. He faces all kinds of opposition, sometimes from superior opponents, but there's something so evil, cunning and scheming about his presence that he finds a way to tilt the scale in his favor. Sauron's not known for being the most powerful, but for being the most twisted, who is the perfect embodiment of all things evil. From the books to the movies, and now the TV series, the character of Sauron has never failed to disappoint, and the fans will want the saga to continue. We hope that the ongoing Rings of Power series can do justice to the legacy of the character when they're done, because it's not often that you come across a villain as intimidating and challenging as the Dark Lord Sauron. Do let us know in the comments below about your thoughts on Sauron and his evil ways. Also, share your favorite moments featuring this character, and also tell us what you think about his role in the ongoing Amazon series. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.